for such a long time on such a high dais, but I'm delighted to have been invited to do this, and you all look very friendly, so I think it's going to be all right. What I'm going to do this evening is firstly just say a few words, maybe 10 minutes or so, about what I'm going to talk about over the next few days. So just sort of giving you a flavour of the approach I want to take to Janet Stuart, and I've called my talks "Discoverer of Her Own Life." Some reflections on Janet Stuart's spiritual journey from 1857 to 1914. So that gives you already a little bit of a flavour. Discoverer and spirituality. Those are two key things that will be coming up over the next few days. But after that, I have another PowerPoint for those of you who might want to refresh your memories about some of the key events in her life, because I shan't be talking in any detail about her biography, about her jobs, her ministries, when she was made Superior General, all that kind of stuff. And again, you will find in your folders, I'm afraid it's rather small, the type is rather small, but the biographical details are on these slides, which I will show at the end, okay? So that hopefully all bases are covered. So here we go. In her essay on colour, which some of you may have read, Janet Stuart describes young people of between the ages of 14 and 21 as discoverers of their own lives. According to her, after this, people become practical, decided on their course in life, rational. She's a little bit optimistic, I think. Decisive. And now this is true, this bit is true. When they get to the age of 50, they become wise. Oh. So that's true. So the discovery of their own lives sort of happens by about 21, according to her. I think she's having a bit of a joke, really, but according to this essay. Now, the reality, of course, as we all know, is different. And at some level, we are all discoverers of our lives, all our lives. And this is the discovery that takes place is the fruit of an interaction between the questions we ask of ourselves, of God, of life, and the questions that are asked of us by the experiences we have, by the occasions that we encounter, or that encounter us. And I was struck while I was watching Wimbledon, the tennis, a few weeks ago, when a commentator described the volleys hit by one player to another as asking questions of the other player. I just thought that was really interesting. These volleys, these tennis balls, were searching questions that tested the mettle of the other player. They were meant to seek out what he or she was made of and how they were able to respond in their play. You will remember the story that Janet tells of her own youthful search for her telos, the end, the purpose, the aim of her life. It's a word that also carries the sense of meaning. What is the meaning of my life? At one level, her search came to an end when she discovered this telos, in her renewed faith in God, in the Catholic Church, that was an important part of her early journey, and then a little later, finding a way of responding to it that satisfied her as a religious in the Society of the Sacred Heart. But of course, her voyage of discovery did not end there. It continued all her life, as it must for each one of us. Such a voyage is a deeply spiritual one, whatever aspect of life is being discovered. And Janet has been most revered in the Society and among its alumni for what she discovered and revealed about education. And within the conservative milieu of the time in which she lived and worked, she was indeed a gifted educator. And she did, I believe, help us to refocus, help the society to refocus on its educational telos and on how it might better respond to and make known the loving and creative heart of Christ in its schools of the late 19th and early 20th century. However, to be honest, and this is a personal view, much of her educational vision for girls, at least in terms of curriculum and aspiration, would not pass muster today. For example, in spite of being a mathematician herself, she didn't really think it was important for the girls at Roehampton to do much maths. And she had what we would see as decidedly backward views on girls going to university. And there were reasons why she had those views, and I won't go into those now, but it just wouldn't do today. So I don't think she's prophetic for us at those levels, at any rate, of her educational vision. I think her greater gift for us is summed up in a passage in one of her last letters to the Roehampton community that she treated as her home even after she became Superior General. She wrote this letter to them from the Mother House in Belgium after her journey around the world in early 1914. So it was not long before she died, and she had visited them after she got back from Australia and the States. And she wrote this: "The spiritual world is so rich, tropically rich." And this is someone who had experienced a little bit of the tropics in Australia, but also earlier in Latin America. So tropically rich, and one longs to explore it and to speak of it to those who care, and that is all of us. I found on my travels the beatitude of hunger and thirst for the things of God all through the society, and I'm quite sure that we must work in the vein of spiritual things, and especially spiritual conversations, to get something for our own hunger and thirst, and something to give to others. I think it's fascinating that after 3 years of travelling around the world, with plenty of leisure, at least during her time at sea, to reflect on her experiences of meeting communities in different corners of the globe, Janet returned to base to begin her real time, her working office time, as it were, as Superior General, fired up with a vision of working in the vein of spiritual things, and convinced of the importance of spiritual conversations, not only for herself, but to get something to give to others. And I wonder if perhaps at this point in 1914, ironically, on the brink of the First World War. She was on the brink of refocusing her interests, at one level, away from school education, and instead of putting more energy into the work of retreats and spiritual conversations in the widest sense, which is partly what the fourth means in the 1815 constitutions points to. So I suggest that she has most to give us today as an educator in prayer and in spiritual life. And she's a good educator, I think, in these matters, because her teaching was drawn from her own practice, and above all, as we shall see, from her own struggles. So in the next few days, I want to invite you and myself on a journey of discovery. A journey on which I hope we will all discover a little about the discoveries she made of her life, particularly her spiritual life, as she ventured further into the telos she had begun to find as a child and a young woman. But this event is not intended to be a conference in the sense of an academic meeting. It has been billed as a reflection or a retreat. So I will also be inviting you and myself to reflect on these discoveries in relation to your own lives. If you remember my metaphor of the tennis players, what questions does Janet's experience lob our way? How do we respond? What is revealed about ourselves as we reflect on her experience? And this doesn't have to be a one-way conversation. Perhaps we might want to challenge her. Perhaps we might find some aspects of her vision irrelevant or not satisfactory for today. So all of that can be part of the conversation. And by reflecting on certain aspects of her life and her spirituality, as it's expressed in some of her life choices, her correspondence, and her conferences, we may be led a little further in companionship with her into companionship, or a deeper companionship, with Christ. And it's this companionship, this friendship with Christ, that she would have seen as important above all. Oh yes, I meant to do that a long time ago. I did that. Has anyone else come across Wordle? Yes. It keeps you awake at night. Yes. I hope that we will be following her spiritual footsteps rather than the external details of her life into a deeper friendship with God. And these may be somewhat wandering footsteps, as any spiritual or psychological journey is rarely from A to Z, probably never, but a spiralling movement. And I got a bit carried away here with some ways in which it's a spiralling movement. I've just shared two. One, perhaps it's a bit like wild swimming, where you don't just swim in a pool, you swim across a lake. And the currents cut backwards and forwards. The seaweed might impede your way a little bit, hampering your progress. You're covering the same ground, but in quite different circumstances each time you swim. And life can be a little bit like that. Now, Janet, I don't know if she ever did any wild swimming. Only boys would have done that in those days. But, of course, she was into hunting. Chasing foxes round and about, round and round the countryside, over the same hedges, but sometimes you'd fall off and sometimes you'd stay on. And an image I think she grew to be even more fond of, it comes up over and over and over again in her writings, is of sailing, because of course she did so much sailing herself, where you're tacking this way and that way to get to the point of your journey. Sometimes you might be becalmed, sometimes you might capsize. Well, I was awake quite a long time when I was thinking up all these images as well. A final point. I referred just now to Companionship with Christ, pinching the title of the anthology that some people may be familiar with, of some of Janet's wise sayings. I think it was published in the 1960s, possibly. This idea of companionship with Christ, of course, it has its roots deep in Christian spirituality and in the Gospels. But one of the sources that is relevant for our reflections is the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. Of course, it permeates the whole of that text. But the bit that I love and that is giving me a sort of structure for this is the bit that is traditionally called the contemplatio, the contemplation to attain, don't like that bit, divine love, at the end of it, in which Ignatius reflects on the relationship between Christ and an individual in terms of the free, mutual giving and receiving of true friends. Janet was to become intimately familiar with the exercises once she entered religious life, and allusions to them permeate her conferences and her private letters. And as will become apparent, the desire for this kind of friendship with Christ was a passionate concern of her spiritual life. The contemplatio contains the prayer, the well-known prayer that begins Suscipe. Receive, Lord, my liberty and accept my understanding, my entire will, and so on and so on. The early part of her life's pilgrimage towards God may be seen in the light of one interpretation of that petition at the end of the Suscipe. Give me only your love and your grace, is how it's usually translated, and in the simple, straightforward sense of let me know more deeply your love. When she later emerges from the first 12 years of her life in the society, and as vicar of the English province, we begin to have access to her letters and her conferences. Her spiritual life is still about this, about let me know your love. But it's also about the second possible reading of Ignatius's words. Give me the grace of more love of you. So not just to know God's or Christ's love for me or for her, but with his grace to love him more. We might call it, as the constitutions do, putting on the mind and heart of Jesus. And finally, there's the third dimension, which is always present, but becomes clearer and clearer, in my view, in the last 6 to 8 years of her life. And it can be expressed in an alternative implied reading of Ignatius's words. Not love me, nor even let me love you, but give me the love with which you love, or give me the heart you love with, that I may be a channel for that grace for others. And I think all of this is implied in the passage I have already referred to in her letter to the Roehampton community. The beatitude of hunger and thirst for the things of God. Longing to explore it, to get something for others. So all those 3 dimensions. So there are several strands here to keep us occupied over the next few days. Janet's ongoing discovery of her telos, the meaning, the purpose of her life. How we might see this journey from the desire to know God's love to a desire to be his love for others. And a third strand, what educative conversations we might have for ourselves and with each other in response to her experiences and her own responses to those experiences. So these are the headings of the talks I'll be giving over the next few days. Finding God, finding Janet in all things, because I think it's a a mutual finding. That's going to be about her early life, seeking what her life was going to be about while she was still living in Cottesmore. The second one on the hyacinth moment, so that's tomorrow afternoon, the famous story of how she comes across this bed of hyacinth flowers in Regent's Park. And the word of God, she said, came to me and I saw it all. The third, fourth and fifth talks are focusing on the journey she made into that telos in her prayer life, as far as we can understand it, from very privileged glimpses in her letters to her spiritual directors and conferences that she gave, which grew immediately out of those letters, well, out of those experiences, I should say. And I think that's all I need to say at the moment about that. But that's what you're in for. I think, therefore, the only thing I want to do now is put on the other slideshow, if that's all right. This is one that I won't talk at all. It has a musical background, hopefully. And it's just taking you through, reminding you about some of the things that happened to Janet in her life. It wasn't a dramatic life at all, just ordinary. And I might say something more about that later on. But it's helpful perhaps to be able to put her into context. So the other Janet is going to help me with that. If it goes too fast, I'm managing this, so I'll try not to make it go too fast. If it goes too fast or you can't read it, these slides and you can look at them later. Okay, thank you.